One of the least attractive places in Australia to invest for a resource company is Victoria because, they've got a constitutional ban on fracking. They've only just recently lifted the ban on conventional gas extraction, but Dan Andrews hasn't exactly, his phone hasn't been lit up with applications from resource companies. Meanwhile, there's a shortfall in Victoria, and some of the gas from your state has had to be diverted to Victoria. Now, none of this makes sense, Matt. I mean, why should Queensland and companies that are extracting gas in Queensland be forced to pay for Victorian incompetence?
Well, look, I do want to put our country first, and I do think Australian businesses deserve to have first crack at Australian gas. That's why when we were in government, we put in place a domestic security gas mechanism that will allow that to happen. But the problem here for Victorian businesses is even if that gas does come from Queensland, it takes a lot. It costs a lot to transport the gas down south. It costs about $2 a gigajoule, and typically priced to be about $8 or $10 a gigajoule for users. So it's a significant cost of transport. And the reason we have so much, we've traditionally had a very strong manufacturing industry in Victoria, is because it's been close to our energy resources of the brown coal of the Latrobe Valley and then later the oil and gas of the Bass Strait. Now, the Victorian Government's closing both of those industries down. It's closing down the brown coal-fired power stations, and as you say, it's putting massive restrictions on gas development. That will necessarily mean the manufacturing industries that were built on the back of that will no longer be there in the future in Victoria. It doesn't matter where we get, if we get gas from Queensland, from WA, from the Middle East, without having proximity to those energy resources, we'll lose those businesses because we have a choice as a country. We can either have cheap energy or we'll get cheap wages. If we don't have the cheap energy that our country's been built on, well then the high wages that we're used to and have become accustomed to, we won't be able to afford. And we're sort of on track at the moment to choose that cheap wages track, which is, to my mind, just nonsensical.
We'll get to the wages in a minute when we talk about the Jobs Summit, but let's just stay on energy for a second because Anthony Albanese and Chris Bowen seem determined to send us down the same path that Europe is already on, pursuing renewables and running down coal and gas. Matt, why can't they see that this will only end in catastrophe, which is already obvious from what's happening in Europe?
Well, seemingly, Fred, it's because a 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirl has convinced them of the wisdom of installing all of this unreliable power. And look, because she has been so successful in her school strikes and persuasive arguments to do that, they've now made election commitments to invest in renewables and what have you. So unfortunately for us, they seem to be persisting, even though all the evidence is pointing to the futility of their energy policies. You're absolutely right to point out Europe and the situation there. But we, in some respects, have been going harder and faster than Europe. The last few years, we've been investing more per person in solar and wind than any European country, indeed about 4 times more than Europe. And that's why we've got this situation here where over winter we couldn't guarantee our lights being on. And you might have seen this week that our energy regulators are warning that over the next 3 years, South Australia, then Victoria, then New South Wales are all facing blackouts unless we can invest in reliable power in the interim. And this is something I've been warning about for years. It's why I think we should continue to build coal and gas-fired power stations. But we have an energy minister in Chris Bowen who's just closing his ears and eyes to this evidence. And that sort of see no evil, hear no evil approach is only going to lead to disaster for us.